I want you to picture this with me for a second. Imagine working yourself to the bone every single day for 10 years straight. Imagine building something with your bare hands, something you're genuinely proud of, something that keeps a roof over your child's head and food on the table. Now imagine that everything you built, every ounce of progress you made, was being quietly, methodically dismantled by someone who saw you as nothing more than a dumping ground. Someone who wore a designer suit and drove a luxury car and smiled at you like you were doing her a favor. That was my life for a decade, and the most jaw-dropping part of this whole story isn't what she did to me. It's what happened when it all finally came crashing down on her. Because when Margaret Holloway's empire collapsed, and I mean completely, spectacularly, publicly collapsed, I was the one left standing. And to this day, people ask me, was I wrong for what I did when I finally had the power to decide her fate? Was I wrong for the choice I made? I want you to watch this entire story, and then I want you to tell me in the comments what you would have done. Because honestly, even now, I go back and forth on it. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I have owned and operated Reeves Auto Repair for going on 15 years now. The shop sits on the corner of Caldwell and 3rd Street in a mid-sized town in Ohio that most people have never heard of unless they grew up there or got stuck there in a snowstorm. It is not a glamorous business. It never was. It is a concrete block building with 4 bays, a waiting room that smells like coffee and motor oil, a vending machine that has been broken in the same specific way since 2019, and a hand-painted sign out front that my late wife, Carol, helped me put up the week we opened. That sign means everything to me. Every time I walk under it, I think of her. Carol passed away from a brain aneurysm when our son Marcus was just 4 years old. One morning she was making pancakes and humming a song I didn't even know the name of, and by the afternoon she was gone, just like that. No warning, no goodbye, nothing. And I was left with a 4-year-old boy, a mortgage, a small business that was just barely getting its legs under it, and a grief so heavy I genuinely did not know if I was going to survive it. But I did survive it because I had Marcus. Because every morning that little boy would climb into bed with me and put his tiny hand on my face and say, "Daddy, you okay?" And I would have to be okay. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart completely. I had a kid who needed lunch packed and homework checked and someone to cheer for him at Little League games. So I kept the shop open. I kept showing up. I hired a part-time babysitter for after-school hours, and I worked until my hands bled some nights, and I slowly, painfully built Reeves Auto Repair into something I was proud of. By the time Marcus was in middle school, we were doing well enough. Not rich, not even close to rich, but stable, comfortable. The lights stayed on, the bills got paid. Marcus had new sneakers when he needed them, and I had managed to hire 3 full-time mechanics and a front desk person named Gloria, who has been with me for 11 years, and who I honestly could not run this place without. And then, about 10 years ago, I got a call that I thought at the time was one of the best things that had ever happened to my business. The call came from a woman named Margaret Holloway. Now, if you lived in our part of Ohio at that time, you knew who Margaret Holloway was. She was the founder and CEO of Holloway Logistics, a company that had started as a small regional trucking operation and had grown over about 15 years into a mid-sized logistics empire. She had a fleet of over 200 commercial vehicles, warehouses on the outskirts of 3 different cities, and a reputation as a ruthless, sharp, brilliant businesswoman. She had been profiled in the Regional Business Journal twice. She drove a black Mercedes and wore her hair in a perfect blonde bob and had a handshake that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of you in whatever negotiation you thought you were having. I knew all of this because people in town talked about her. She was the kind of local success story that everyone referenced in conversations about ambition and hard work, and what was possible if you were willing to grind. So when her assistant called and said that Ms. Holloway was interested in establishing a relationship with my shop for some overflow mechanical work, I nearly fell out of my chair. I called Gloria into my office and told her, and she actually clapped. We thought this was our big break. We thought this was the thing that was going to take Reeves Auto Repair to the next level. We were so naive. We were so completely and utterly naive. The first few months of working with Holloway Logistics seemed genuinely promising. They would send over 1 or 2 vehicles at a time, usually delivery vans or smaller box trucks, things that needed routine service or minor repairs, oil changes, brake work, tire rotations. The payment terms were net 30, meaning they paid their invoices within 30 days, which is pretty standard in commercial accounts. My guys handled the work professionally. I kept the pricing fair, and things seemed to be going smoothly. Margaret Holloway herself came by the shop twice in those first few months, walked through the bays, asked intelligent questions about our capacity and our turnaround times, and told me that she was impressed with what I had built. I remember feeling genuinely proud that day. I remember thinking that Carol would have been proud too. But somewhere around the 4 or 5 month mark, something started to shift. And it happened so gradually that I didn't even recognize it for what it was until we were already deep into it. The vehicles they started sending over stopped being vans with minor maintenance needs. They started being trucks with serious engine problems. Not just old trucks, but trucks that had clearly been neglected for months or even years. Trucks with engine damage that suggested they had been run hard with no maintenance whatsoever. Trucks with transmission issues so severe that my lead mechanic, a guy named Roy who has been working on engines for 30 years, would shake his head and say, "Dan, whoever was supposed to be maintaining this thing just wasn't." And then a little while after that, they started sending trucks that weren't just in need of repair. They were sending trucks that were, in my professional opinion, beyond economical repair. Trucks where the cost of fixing them properly would far exceed what the vehicle was actually worth. I brought this up to the Holloway Logistics account manager, a nervous young guy named Trevor, who always looked like he was one bad day away from a breakdown. I told Trevor that several of the recent units they had sent us were in such poor condition that I wasn't sure we could bring them back to roadworthy status at a cost that made any business sense. Trevor would listen, nod, and then say something like, "Mems, Holloway just wants them assessed and whatever can be done should be done." So we would do what we could, document everything carefully, write up honest estimates that reflected the true scope of the problem, and send the invoices. And here's where the second problem started to emerge. They stopped paying on time. Net 30 became net 60, net 60 became net 90, and sometimes the invoices just sat there, unpaid with no explanation, until I called Trevor and he would apologize profusely and promise a check was coming. I should have ended the relationship right there. I know that now. I knew it on some level then. But here is the thing about having a commercial account with a company the size of Holloway Logistics, even when things are getting rocky. The volume of work they were bringing in was significant. It was keeping my guys busy. It was keeping the bays full. And I kept telling myself that a big company like that doesn't just disappear without paying its bills. I kept telling myself that this was growing pains, that they were expanding fast, that cash flow issues happen to good companies all the time, and that I just needed to be patient and protect the relationship. I was wrong on every single count. Year 2 rolled into year 3, and year 3 into year 4, and the pattern just kept deepening. More broken down vehicles, more deferred payments, and now something new, something that took me a while to fully understand what I was looking at. They started sending vehicles that had clearly already been to other shops before coming to me. Vehicles with repair orders from other mechanics stuck in the glove box, vehicles with parts that had been recently replaced but improperly installed, vehicles that had been jury-rigged in ways that were actually making the underlying problems worse. I started asking Roy and my other mechanics about this, and Roy's theory, which I eventually came to believe was exactly right, was that Holloway Logistics had a pattern. They would run their vehicles into the ground through neglect. When something broke catastrophically, they would send it to one shop, get a quote, maybe have some minimal work done, and then when that shop got frustrated with the deferred payments or the condition of the vehicles, they would shift that vehicle to another shop and start the cycle over. And I was the latest stop in that cycle. Except I had been in that cycle for years at this point, and I had not fully understood what I was stuck in. By year 5, I sat down one night after Marcus had gone to bed, spread every single Holloway Logistics invoice across my kitchen table, and added everything up. The total outstanding balance they owed me, combining overdue invoices, partial payments that never came, and work we had done that they had disputed for nonsensical reasons, was over $68,000. $68,000. I sat there at that kitchen table, in my quiet house, with the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and I felt sick to my stomach. Because $68,000 was not just a number to me. It was Marcus's college fund contributions for 2 years. It was new lifts for 2 of my bays. It was 3 months of payroll for my entire team. It was real, tangible money that I had earned through real, honest work, and it was sitting in a file folder in a corporation's accounting department like it simply did not matter. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Mendez, and she was sharp and direct and did not sugarcoat anything. She sent a formal demand letter to Holloway Logistics. She threatened legal action. And you know what happened? Margaret Holloway's corporate attorney called Patricia and proposed a payment plan. 50% within 60 days, the remainder over the following 6 months. It sounded like progress. It sounded like accountability. And they did pay the first installment. Just under $35,000 arrived in my account 8 weeks later, and I remember exhaling for the first time in what felt like months. But the second installment never came, and the third never came, and by the time I was gearing up to actually take them to court, something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Holloway Logistics announced, in a terse press release on a Thursday morning, that they were temporarily suspending operations due to what they called significant financial restructuring. The phones went dead. Trevor's email bounced, the account manager was gone, and Margaret Holloway, the woman who had been building her logistics empire for 15 years, was nowhere to be found. It turned out that Holloway Logistics had been in serious financial trouble for far longer than anyone outside the company had known. There were stories in the regional business press within weeks of the announcement. Creditors were lined up from here to Cleveland. It came out that the company had been taking on contracts it couldn't fulfill, had been borrowing against assets it didn't fully own, and had been shuffling money between accounts in ways that the investigators were still trying to untangle. Several former employees came forward with stories about Margaret's management style, about being pressured to cut corners, about vendors being strung along for months and years with partial payments and empty promises. My story was not unique. It was just one chapter in a much longer and more sordid book. The company formally filed for bankruptcy within 2 months of that press release. Patricia walked me through what that meant for recovering the money I was owed. It was not a pretty conversation. When a company enters bankruptcy, unsecured creditors, which is what I was, line up behind secured creditors, meaning the banks and the major lenders who have collateral. The realistic expectation, Patricia told me gently, was that I might recover somewhere between 10 and 30 cents on the dollar of what I was owed, and that process could take years. I did the math in my head while she was still talking. Even in the best-case scenario, I was looking at losing tens of thousands of dollars that I had earned, that my guys had earned, that we had stayed late and gotten our hands dirty, and done right by to earn. I went home that night and sat in the driveway in my truck for a long time before going inside. Marcus was 17 by then, starting to talk seriously about colleges, starting to think about his future, and I was sitting in a driveway trying to figure out how a decade of being taken advantage of had led me here. So that is the situation I was in. That is the full weight of what 10 years of this relationship had done to my shop and my family, and I had to make a decision about what came next. And before I tell you what happened, I want you to stop right now and drop a comment below. Knowing everything that Margaret Holloway had done to me, knowing the broken engines and the delayed payments, and the tens of thousands of dollars that her company owed me, if you were sitting in my driveway that night, what would you have done next? What would your instinct have been? Because I want to know. And I want you to keep that answer in mind as I finish this story, because what happened next is something I genuinely did not see coming. And it is going to change the way you think about everything I just told you. About 3 months after the bankruptcy filing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a Saturday morning. Marcus was at a friend's house, and I was in the shop catching up on paperwork. I almost didn't answer. When I did, the voice on the other end was quieter than I remembered it, softer, stripped of all the polish and authority that had once made it so intimidating. It was Margaret Holloway. She asked if she could come and speak with me in person. Not her attorney, not an intermediary. Her, personally. I said almost nothing for a long moment. Then I said yes. I don't fully know why. Maybe I needed to look her in the eye. Maybe I needed to understand. Maybe some part of me that I hadn't fully acknowledged yet already knew something about what I was going to do. She arrived at the shop the following Tuesday afternoon. She was driving a used Honda Civic. I noticed that immediately because I noticed cars. The black Mercedes was gone, and with it every external marker of the life she had built and lost. She looked different. I don't want to be cruel about it, because what I am about to say is not about cruelty. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally been forced to put it down. She was dressed simply, a plain blazer, dark pants, no jewelry that I could see. She walked into my waiting room and looked around at the space, at the chairs, at the hand-painted sign visible through the window, and she sat down across from me without being invited to. She talked for almost 2 hours, and I listened. I let her talk because I felt like I owed it to myself to hear it, all of it, without interrupting. She told me about the early days of Holloway Logistics, about how she had built it from nothing, how proud she had been of what she created, how intoxicating the growth had felt in those middle years, when everything seemed to be expanding faster than she could manage. She told me about the moment she first realized the company was in real trouble, which was earlier than I expected, almost 6 years before the collapse. She had made a series of bad contracts, had expanded into markets she didn't understand, had trusted advisors who turned out to be either incompetent or dishonest, and had found herself in a financial hole that she kept thinking she could dig out of if she just worked harder, pushed further, delayed a few more payments. She told me about the vendors she had stiffed. She told me about the mechanics and the suppliers and the small businesses that she had used and underpaid, and sometimes not paid at all, because she was too focused on keeping the larger operation alive to think about the people she was stepping on to do it. She said she had convinced herself that it was temporary, that she would pay everyone back when things turned around, that the small guys could handle waiting a little longer, because they didn't have her level of exposure. And then she said something that I have thought about many times since that conversation. She said, "I told myself that story so many times that I stopped being able to see the people behind the invoices. I just saw numbers. And then one day I woke up and there was nothing left, and the numbers had faces and I had to live with that." She was not crying when she said it. I want to be clear about that. She was not performing remorse or trying to manipulate me emotionally. She said it the way you say something true that you have come to understand too late and have to live with anyway. And I believed her. Not because I had forgotten what she had done, or because the money she owed me suddenly didn't matter, but because I have been a human being long enough to recognize when another human being is telling you the truth about themselves, even when that truth is not flattering. Then she told me why she had come. She had been speaking with the bankruptcy trustee and with several of the major creditors about a potential resolution. There was a scenario, still being negotiated, in which some of the company's remaining assets could be liquidated in a way that provided slightly better recovery for unsecured creditors like me. But the more interesting thing she told me was this: she had a potential opportunity. A former colleague, someone who had worked with her in the early days of the company, had approached her about a small consulting role, helping to restructure the logistics operation of a regional food distribution company. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't anything close to what she had been doing at the height of Holloway Logistics. But it was legitimate work, and it would pay her enough to start making voluntary payments to the people she owed beyond whatever the bankruptcy proceedings produced. She was not asking me for anything specific. She was not asking me to drop my creditor claim or to forgive what she owed me. She was asking me, and I understand now that this is a strange thing to ask, for my opinion. She said she had been thinking about which of the people she had wronged she most needed to face directly, and my name had risen to the top of that list. Not because I was the largest creditor, I wasn't, but because, she said, she had driven past my shop dozens of times over the years and had watched me keep it going, had seen me put up new equipment, had seen my son grow up through the shop windows almost, and she had never once stopped to reckon with what she was costing me. She said watching my shop survive and grow even while she was taking from it had made it harder to keep lying to herself about what she was doing. I sat with all of that for a long moment. And then I told her the thing that I had been sitting with since the night I spread those invoices across my kitchen table. I told her that I was not going to pretend the money didn't matter, because it did matter, and it had cost me and my team in real and concrete ways. I told her that I was going to pursue every penny owed to me through the bankruptcy process, and that I expected her voluntary payment plan, if she was serious about it, to be put in writing through Patricia's office. I told her that I had no interest in making her feel better about what she had done, and that forgiveness, if it came, was going to be a private thing that I worked out on my own terms, and not something I was going to perform for her benefit. And then I told her the other thing. The thing that surprised even me a little bit when I said it out loud. I told her that I hoped she did the consulting work. I told her that whatever the work was, I hoped she did it with honesty and transparency, and that she treated the people she worked with like they were real people with real stakes in the outcome. Not because she deserved a second chance in any cosmic sense, but because I believed that the world generally worked better when people who had made serious mistakes were given the opportunity to make different choices going forward, and because I had a son who was about to go out into the world, and I wanted to believe that the world he was entering was one where genuine accountability could lead to something other than complete destruction. She looked at me for a long moment when I finished, and then she nodded, just once, slowly, and she said, "Thank you for listening to me." And she left. The months that followed were long and complicated, in the way that financial and legal processes always are. The bankruptcy proceedings moved at their own glacial pace. Patricia stayed on top of it, and eventually, about 14 months after the filing, I received a recovery check from the trustee. It was not 30 cents on the dollar, it was closer to 22, which meant that after 10 years of work and a mountain of frustration and legal fees, I recovered roughly $45,000 of the over $68,000 I was owed. I took that check and stared at it for a while. Then I cashed it and put half of it directly into Marcus's college account, because that is where it should have been going all along. Margaret did follow through on the voluntary payment arrangement. It took almost 3 years, with payments that were sometimes small and sometimes a little larger, but Patricia confirmed each one when it came in, and they all came in. By the time the last one arrived, the total additional amount recovered brought me close to 85% of what I had originally been owed. Not 100%, but close enough that the wound, while it never fully disappeared, at least closed. Gloria framed the final payment confirmation and put it on the wall of my office without telling me. I walked in one morning and there it was, next to Carol's photo and a drawing Marcus had made when he was 6 that depicts me as a stick figure, holding a wrench and surrounded by cars that look like potatoes. I stood in front of it for a while. Then I went out into the bays and got to work. Marcus did go to college. He's studying mechanical engineering, which should surprise exactly no one who has watched that kid grow up around engines and grease and problem solving. He worked part-time at the shop all through high school and saved enough that his first year was covered almost entirely without loans. He calls me every Sunday. Sometimes we talk about cars, sometimes about whatever is happening in his life, and sometimes he asks me to tell him the story of how I built the shop from nothing after his mom died, and I tell it to him the same way every time, because I want him to know exactly where he came from, and exactly what it cost, and exactly why it was worth it. As for Reeves Auto Repair, we are still here, same corner of Caldwell and 3rd Street, same hand-painted sign. We added a 5th bay 2 years ago, which was something I had been wanting to do for a long time. Roy is still with me, still shaking his head at the state of engines that come through the door. Gloria is still here, still keeping everything running with a level of competence that I am frankly not sure I deserve. We have good commercial accounts now, real ones, with people who pay on time and treat us like partners rather than a place to dump their problems. I have thought a lot about what the right lesson of this story is. I have thought about whether I was too patient with Margaret Holloway for too long, and the honest answer is yes. I should have seen the signs earlier, and I should have protected myself more aggressively. I have thought about whether the choice I made in that office, to tell her I hoped she succeeded rather than to simply write her off, was the right one. And I think it was, not because she deserved that from me, but because it was consistent with who I want to be, and with the kind of person I want Marcus to see when he looks at his father. There is a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life furious at Margaret Holloway, and I understand that version completely because the anger was entirely justified. But I did not want to spend the rest of my life in it. I wanted to spend the rest of my life in this shop under Carol's sign, doing good work and watching my son become the kind of person who makes the world slightly better than he found it. That is the whole story. 10 years, $68,000, one collapsed empire, and one conversation in a waiting room that smelled like coffee and motor oil. And I am genuinely curious what you think. If you think I handled it right, if you think I let her off too easy, if you think I should have been harder or softer or something else entirely, I want to know. Drop it in the comments below. If you were on my side through this whole story, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Because I have more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people navigating extraordinary situations, and I think you're going to want to be here for them. Share this one with someone you know who has ever been taken advantage of and still managed to keep going, And as always, I'll see you all in the next story.